The other day, I figured out how to put the way I go about life into a single sentence. It then occurred to me that life was far too expansive. One couldn't possibly do such a thing. However, it felt like an important sentence, so I thought I'd share it with you. I strive to be cheap, sensitive, and naked to the world. As language is subjective, those words probably mean something different to you than to me. Let's break it into parts and elaborate on each. I strive to be cheap. I strive to be cheap not for the sake of money, but for the sake of time. When I work, I trade my time for money. I then trade that money for services and things. Simply put, the less money I spend, the less time I must spend earning money, and more time I have for other things. This matters to me because I believe my time is super valuable. And I'm not that into the act of spending my time earning money. I enjoy traveling, reading books, writing, running, being among nature, hanging out with good friends, and at least a couple dozen other things, much more than any job at which I've traded my time for money. And I've found some pretty sweet places to trade my time for money too. Essentially, I strive to be cheap so that I can spend my time doing the things I love to do. Some things I strive to be cheap at include avoiding rent, buying less, and buying used. Goodwill and OfferUp are great for this. Cooking my own food instead of eating out, walking or bicycling instead of paying for gas to get around, and living in countries with lower costs of living than the United States. I strive to be sensitive. Sensitive, not in the sense of easily having my feelings hurt, but senses that are strongly attuned. To be moved more by less. Take the analogy of volume of music through headphones. Regardless of the volume at which you're listening, unless it's so loud it hurts, turning down the volume is always a negative experience, dulling the intensity. Conversely, turning up the volume is always a positive experience, increasing the intensity and your connection to the music. The funny thing is, within a large range, it doesn't really matter where the volume of the music began. If you increase the volume from there, great. If you decrease the volume from there, that sucks. Like with headphones, our satisfaction with the volume of life is not based on some objective scale, but relative to what we're used to. In certain ways, I try to keep the volume of daily life a tad lower, so that many interactions with the world are like that experience of turning the volume up. Some ways I strive to be this sort of sensitive include literally keeping the volume of music through headphones lower and increasing it at the climax of a song or during my favorite ones. Usually drinking water, black coffee, and unsweetened teas. Meditating, walking, running, and bicycling without headphones. Turning off notifications for most apps on my phone and keeping Facebook only accessible by computer. Over time, these simple, bare acts heighten their own experience and the experiences of all acts that are not simple and bare. I strive to be naked to the world. I strive to be naked to the world, to be exposed to it. To be exposed to the world is to feel more, from happiness to sadness, from wonder to pain. And to feel more is to notice more, learn more, and have greater awareness. To be naked to the world also means less between me and everything else. To shed barriers is to shed separateness. Such nakedness opens one up to the unexpected and unseekable. Raised in the hot, dry desert, I also enjoy being as close to physically naked as possible as well. Some ways I strive to be naked to the world include striving to be real, open, and deep in conversation, traveling to the greatest degree of exposure that I'm comfortable with, going barefoot as often as possible, saying yes more often, and peeling clothes off whenever mildly acceptable. The unsung gifts of less. I initially hesitated to write this article, as being cheap, sensitive, and naked to the world are not exactly signs of status in our culture. Think about it. Calling someone cheap is an insult. Far from sensitive, we saturate our lives with constant doing and watching and listening, often at the same time. We're a people plagued by FOMO, which is fear of missing out. From clothes to cars to houses, we display our worth to others with the very things that oppose our nakedness. However, do notice that being cheap, sensitive, and naked to the world all take a degree of discipline and contain gifts. Holding on to money is harder than spending it, but spends time wisely. Being more sensitive requires the deliberate choice of less, but cultivates greater immersion and awareness. Getting naked to the world forgoes feeling comfort and security, but brings us closer to it. The gifts of less are often overlooked because we live in an economically informed society, which I'll try to illustrate to you with a quote from Joseph Campbell from a PBS interview series entitled The Power of Myth. You can tell what's informing a society by what the tallest building is. When you approach a medieval town, the cathedral is the tallest thing in the place. When you approach an 18th century town, it is the political palace that's the tallest thing in the place. And when you approach a modern city, the tallest places are the office buildings, the centers of economic life. If you go to Salt Lake City, you see the whole thing illustrated right in front of your face. First, the temple was built right in the center of the city. This is the proper organization because the temple is the spiritual center from which everything flows in all directions. Then, the political building, the Capitol, was built beside it, and it's taller than the temple. And now, the tallest thing is the office building that takes care of the affairs of both the temple and the political building. That's the history of Western civilization, from the Gothic through the princely periods of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries to this economic world that we're in now. In our economically informed society, more is the sound of the beating heart of our must-grow economy. The messaging of more is so woven into our days that we almost forget it's there. If you live in a city, you're exposed to an estimated 5,000 advertisements per day. Advertising is on billboards, television, the radio, in Google searches, before YouTube videos, on most social media apps, most websites, on the news, every free app on your phone, and every single brand name you see. All of it is offering more to your life. And while being constantly bombarded by this idea of adding to our lives, it's easy to forget that it can be just as worth it to subtract from them. And that's a problem, because the gifts of less, the gifts I found in what may seem so out of strife as being cheap, sensitive, and naked to the world, are buried by that constant messaging of more. And that's why I feel that's so important a sentence. Thanks for listening. Have a great week in life and all that jazz.